I don't know. I guess I don't quite understand what's the purpose of him saying, of Shimon Bar Yochai saying this, I guess.
I
What he's
guess to
getting
me,
at.
like
Right.
the what this is getting at is that it's not all good stuff, right?
Right.
Joining to a nation also comes with some suffering. The
historical context is probably somewhat important here. Shimon Bar Yochai this is in the wake of the Bar Kokhba rebellion. So
Right,
the Romans are really trashing the place. And he's looking at a lot of suffering around him and saying, well, I guess this is the price of the land.
Yeah. So he's
Yeah,
sort of
I'm-
justifying the suffering, or making it make sense and somehow have meaning.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's maybe more descriptive than prescriptive, in the sense of, like, it's a struggle to receive the Torah. I mean, the stories we have of Bar Yochai are that, you know, he runs away to the mountains and spends 12 years, 13 years in a cave, you know, just receiving the Torah. Like, he's our image of like a talking head, just in pure intellect, right? But there's suffering involved in that. Yeah, Bas.
What I get out of it is, for me, it is like, it very clearly says Torah, Israel, and the world are all connected. And only by making mistakes do we learn how to make it better.
Nice. I love that.
And that
The
is
Torah,
one
the land of
suffering.
Israel, the Torah, the land of Israel, and the world to come, all of them are processes by which, through suffering, through mistakes, through living, we can hopefully get to a place of greater justice.
Yes.
Yeah, certainly that's my hope.
Mine too.
Is it just the regular suffering of life, or is it more than that? Are we supposed to be punishing ourselves on a regular basis? I mean, this is bothersome to me.
Not
Yeah, yeah.
self-punishment.
Say more about why it bothers you.
Well, I don't think you need to suffer to benefit. I don't. If you told me you had to work hard or something like that, I might accept that. But I don't understand the chastisement and the suffering to gain benefit.
Yeah.
Maybe you need to have some struggle of some sort, because struggle could be positive, could feel positive, but it could also feel like suffering. Maybe that's it. I don't know.
Maybe this is a statement that we can disagree with. Maybe he's not right.
That's the idea.
Well, I always think that there's a permission to do that. All right, let's look at one more text before. Yeah, Andy.
Sorry, I mean, you look at, the Passover story, the Exodus, right? Is the reason that we had to be slaves was to suffer so that we could gain this benefit? Is that the justification of that slavery?
I'm not sure.
Well, maybe
I'm
to
not sure.
fully appreciate what freedom is, you have to lose it.
Yeah,
I have a lot of
I'm not
trouble
sure
with
that
this.
for me
this-
so much. Andy, I'm with you.
I'm seeing it as
Yeah, go ahead, Steve.
But sometimes you have to be corrected, right? If you don't do something right to make it better.
Yeah, Yeah, I'm seeing it as being about imperfections. There's a task we have to do. We're not going to do it perfectly. When we screw up, there's going to be a price to pay for that, but we have to do the task anyway and accept the fact that there's going to be some missteps that we'll suffer for. But that's the only way we can move forward.
I could live with that explanation.
Yeah, I think it's closer to that than it is to suffering is meaningful in and of itself, right? There's this passage in the Talmud where the rabbis are suffering from illness and they get healed, and the one rabbi asked the other rabbi, like, which would you prefer, like not to have suffered or to have suffered and get the reward for suffering? And the rabbis all say, I'd rather not suffer. Right? I don't want the reward. I don't want the suffering. Don't give me both of these. And yet, right? Like, I don't know. I sort of think about the story of do you guys all see the movie The Matrix?
Oh, yeah.
No? Okay. Well, in the movie The Matrix,
I saw it.
It's like a midrash on the Garden of Eden. But the basic idea of the Matrix is human beings are all just batteries. Like, our heat is feeding these computers that are running everything. And the computers have us all in like these little pods where we're just, our brains are hooked in to the matrix. And the conceit is they tried to make like a perfect world and people didn't believe it. They we're so wired to need suffering as part of existence that if we were in a like perfect world, we would realize that we were in the matrix. But when we're in a world like our world, like a world that has suffering and moments of joy, then we don't realize that we're all just batteries for the machines. The point of it is like that if it's easy to say I don't want suffering and I don't want the reward from suffering, but we also wouldn't want to go to a state of no growth and no learning and no change, right? The Garden of Eden is a place where you're perpetually a child, perpetually fed, perpetually cared for, perpetually, right? There's no illness, there's no death, there's nothing, but there's also no growth, no learning, no meaning. And it doesn't mean that the suffering is worthwhile because of that, but there is some, medium place there, I think.
All right.
All right. I
Natural
want
order,
to,
again, tendencies to,
I want us to look at the
ahead.
Israeli Army Code of Ethics.
Okay.
Let's look at that. It's the thing in the background reading for this week. All right. The Israeli Army Code of Ethics. Has anybody read this before? I mean, before this class? I remember learning about
Never
it,
seen it
reading about
before.
in high school. So, but this is the Israeli Army Code of Ethics. As far as I know, most armies do not have a document called the Code of Ethics of that army. Okay. There are some rules in the United States Army, but I don't think that there is like a clear, 2-page code of ethics. And I if there is, I've never seen it. That doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. All right. So the Israeli Army Code of Ethics. The mission of the Israeli Defense Force is to defend the existence, territorial integrity, and sovereignty of the state of Israel, to protect the inhabitants of Israel, and to combat all forms of terrorism which threaten the daily life. The Israeli Defense Forces are the state of Israel's military force. The IDF is subordinate to the directions of the democratic civilian authorities and the laws of the state. The goal of the IDF is to protect the existence of the state of Israel and our independence, and to thwart all enemy efforts to disrupt the normal way of life in Israel. IDF soldiers are obligated to fight, to dedicate all their strength and even sacrifice their lives in order to protect the state of Israel, her citizens and residents. IDF soldiers will operate according to the IDF values and orders while adhering to the laws of the state and the norms of human dignity, and honoring the values of the state of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. The spirit of the IDF is the identity card of the IDF values, which should stand as the foundation of all the activities of every IDF soldier on regular or reserve duty. The spirit of the IDF and the guidelines of operation resulting from it are the ethical code of the IDF. The spirit of the IDF will be applied by the IDF, its soldiers, its officers, its units and corps to shape their mode of action. They will behave, educate, and evaluate themselves and others according to the spirit of the IDF. The spirit of the IDF draws on four sources: the tradition of the IDF and its military heritage as the Israel Defense Forces, the tradition of the state of Israel, its democratic principles, laws, and institutions, the tradition of the Jewish people throughout their history, and universal moral values based on the value and dignity of human life. Basic values: defense of the state, its citizens, and its residents. The IDF's goal is to defend the existence of the state of Israel, its independence, and the security of the citizens and residents of the state. Love of the homeland and loyalty to the country. At the core of service to the IDF stand the love of homeland and the commitment to and devotion to the state of Israel, a democratic state that serves as the national home for the Jewish people, its citizens, and its residents. Human dignity. The IDF and its soldiers are obligated to protect human dignity. Every human being is of value regardless of his or her origin, religion, nationality, gender, status, or position. The values: tenacity of purpose in performing missions and drive to victory. The IDF servicemen and women will fight and conduct themselves with courage in the face of all dangers and obstacles. They will persevere in their missions resolutely and thoughtfully, even to the point of endangering their lives. Responsibility. The IDF servicemen or women will see themselves as an active participant in the defense of the state, its citizens, and residents. They will carry out their duties at all times with initiative, involvement, and diligence, with common sense, and within the framework of their authority, while prepared to bear responsibility for their conduct. Credibility. IDF servicemen and women shall present things objectively, completely, and precisely in planning, performing, and reporting. They will act in such a manner that their peers and commanders can rely upon them in performing their tasks. Personal example. The IDF servicemen and women will comport themselves as required of them and demand of themselves as they demand of others, out of recognition of their ability and responsibility within the military and without, to serve as a deserving role model. Human life. The IDF servicemen and women will act in a judicious and safe manner in all that they do, out of recognition of the supreme value of human life. During combat, they will endanger themselves and their comrades only to the extent required to carry out their mission. Purity of arms. The IDF servicemen and women will use their weapons and force only for the purpose of their mission, only to the necessary extent, and will maintain their humanity even in combat. IDF soldiers will not use their weapons and force to harm human beings who are non-combatants or prisoners of war, and will do all in their power to avoid causing harm to their lives, bodies, dignity, and property. Professionalism. The IDF servicemen and women will acquire the professional knowledge and skills required to perform their tasks and will implement them while striving continuously to perfect their personal and collective achievements. Discipline. IDF servicemen and women will strive to the best of their ability to fully and successfully complete all that is required of them according to orders and their spirit. IDF soldiers will be meticulous in giving only lawful orders and shall refrain from obeying blatantly illegal orders. Comradeship. IDF servicemen and women will act out of fraternity and devotion to their comrades and will always go to their assistance when they need their help or depend on them, despite any danger or difficulty, even to the point of risking their lives. Sense of mission. IDF soldiers view their service in the IDF as a mission. They will be ready to give their all in order to defend the state, its citizens, and residents. This is due to the fact that they are representatives of the IDF who act on the basis and in the framework of the authority given to them in accordance with IDF orders. So what do you think?
It's very idealistic, I think, which I guess it ought to be. Makes sense.
All right.
US does have one. Thanks, Steve.
Yeah, I had a quick look at it. It's not rooted in values in the same way that the Israeli one is.
No,
It's more, I will do this, I will do that, but it doesn't say much about why.
yeah.
Is there
To me-
anything in the Uniform Code, military justice?
Yeah, I'm sure there are. I'm sure there are. To me, like a big amazing thing about this is, right, it says right in the code of ethics of the Israeli armed forces that it's incumbent upon every soldier to decide whether their commander is giving them an illegal order and to refuse to carry it out if it's illegal.
It sounded to me like it's really a statement against what the German army was claiming during World War II. And it's
Absolutely.
kind of a direct argument against that sort of behavior.
Well, exactly. It's not good enough to say I was following orders. You have to also think about whether the orders that you're being given are lawful or moral. Also, the paragraph on purity of arms is a very, very powerful language, right? To only use force when necessary, to only use it to the extent necessary. Does this always happen? I think not, but that's what they're striving for. Andy.
Yeah, I was surprised in the spirit of the IDF draws on 4 sources. And I mean, only one of those is the tradition of the Jewish people, right? But then you go to this other basis, this universal moral values, not God-given values or something along those lines. It's this universal norm, right? So
Yeah.
that kind of surprised me.
On the other hand, not every soldier is Jewish in the IDF.
That's true.
And
And a lot of the ones that are don't necessarily consider themselves religiously Jewish. All right, so we're going to jump in.
I was wondering if that line is for the Hasidim.
If that line is for who?
For the secular part of the population.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think it is So it's interesting, like going back to this sort of question of universalism and particularism, and how that manifests itself. Like the first three here are very particular, but then also universal ethics.
Well,
Can there
also the
there be-
value and dignity of human life is part of the Jewish thing also, I guess.
Yes, no question.
Comes from it. Yeah.
No question. Okay. So I was just about to share my screen with the video, and it turns out the only thing that downloaded was the audio. So I'm trying to get it to play the video. All right, so I'm going to share my screen. We're going to watch not the lecture part, but the discussion part, which I think gives you just as much. I mean, the lecture is good. You can go back and watch it if you want. All right. Can you see this?
Not yet. There you go.
In the lecture, I tried to move the conversation from nationalism or globalism to an inner conversation about, if nationalism, what would a moral nationalism look like? Tal, welcome. Is it a waste of time? Is it too late for the category? I could move myself deeply by talking about, oh, nationalism, and do an inner move. Or in the current environment, the minute you use the word nationalism, does it turn off too many people? And is the whole attempt to redeem nationalism, which I've been really trying to do over these last two series, futile?
Well, first of all, it's not a waste of time because it's so many people are in that mode across the world. We can't close our eyes to the fact that people are insisting on their rights as a collective in terms of nationalism. So that matters simply because it's happening. But it matters for a different reason as well. And that is, in my mind, self-determination is a in fact, in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the most important human rights treaty in the world, Article 1 is that people have a right to self-determination. And what that means, in my mind at least, is that people, as an individual human right, have a right to a collective identity. They have a right to a past and a right to nurture that identity into the future. And nationalism at its heart, at its best, when thought of as an idea, is the embodiment of that human right. And I don't think we can turn away from it, because doing so would be to make people less themselves than who they are.
But I'm hearing the argument, say that, just don't use the word nationalism. I have no problem with that version of nationalism. But since Donald Trump, since Orban, since whoever it might be, they're using the category, the minute you use it, I can't be a part of it.
So, I mean, your lecture touched on this. I think the semantic discussion is less significant. Which word we use and
But
why.
people care about that.
Yeah, people care about it. I think nationalism is not a dirty word, right? I think nationalism says that there is such a thing as nations because people identify with groups that they have a common story with. And that requires understanding and embracing. The fact that someone whose politics we may disagree with uses that term does not violate the term. And I think we fall into a pretty dangerous trap when we allow other people to hijack words in that way.
Now, I find we have a very short version. Again, I know I'm convincing and moving myself deeply on this subject, but there's a certain political reality now. And every few years, a term stops being kosher. It becomes, and then it gets dropped up, then it comes back. And who knows, now we're shaping our whole conversation within a particular partisan, really nasty moment.
Yeah.
I remember once I was lecturing a group of students and of a group of academics, and I said, I'm a Zionist. And one of the people said to me, Daniil, could you not use that term? Because the minute you use that term, I feel that you're legitimizing the occupation. I said, how did I say? I spoke about Zionism as the right of the Jewish people to self-determination in their homeland. So she says, why don't you use that term? I said, it's not that catchy. I said, so that's what it means. And so I'm finding one of our challenges in this whole series is whether, as you said, we allow people to own our words or whether we reclaim them.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, as the Jewish people, we get to play the long game, right? We get to, even if for a particular moment a word is out of favor, I don't think we have to abandon that word. But as educators, we do have an obligation to put that word in a proper context. So when you use the word Zionism or talk about nationalism, you need to be quick to define your term so that people don't steal it from you or assume things that you don't mean.
And I think also part of this whole one home, two home story that you introduced at the beginning of the whole series is that one of the reasons why I can't give it up is that, well, maybe certain groups within certain political affiliations in North America or in other places might feel less comfortable with the term. In Israel, it's here.
Yeah.
And one of the consequences of being able to talk to each other is to allow the best reading of a term that the other one thinks is self-evident. Otherwise, we're not even able to talk to each
Right.
other.
So a big chunk of the Jewish people lives and feels this sense of nationalism. And part of being as part of a people means trying to give the best interpretation to that possible and also expecting that that best interpretation be lived out. But if you cut it off from the conversation, you're essentially cutting off the opportunity for peoplehood.
So, Tal, you and I, we've convinced each other.
Yes.
We're good. We've convinced each other. Whether we've convinced you, it's my prayer. Try it. I know it's a little lonely. And I know sometimes you might get attacked. And I know because there's a violence. There's a violence to the contemporary discourse. Actually, in the name of openness, of what words? There's a word police. There's a thought. I know it's difficult.
We live at a moment where words are almost used more to label people than to persuade people or have a discall So
I have to remember that.
Yeah,
I love it.
so
we use words to
label
people
rather than to persuade
You
them,
should
right?
make up. That's one of those. That's a Talism. We all have to remember. It's beautiful.
Yeah,
Thank you.
and we can't let that happen. But what I wanted to add to that is I think if you believe that nationalism is a moral good or can be a moral good, and I do, then it can only be a moral good if it's also a nationalism for others, right? It can't be that you embrace a nationalism as a good only for you, because I think that empties it of its moral meaning, essentially.
So let me ask you then, now that we've convinced ourselves, as I said, and hopefully some of our audience, or at least to try, to take the long game, not to let the politics of the moment determine the language, because then we'll even lose our words. It'll be like 1984, in the movie, like we don't want people to have a feeling. You think you could keep the feeling without words, and it doesn't work that way. But please join me in this overall enterprise of reflecting on can nationalism be redeemed?
Yes.
And I spoke about interests and different ways of looking at those interests. But I want to pursue your take on how nationalism could be redeemed. When does nationalism cross a line? And in essence, the core question is that a category can only be redeemed if there's also a sense of when it's not redeemed. That it's not something that contains, that all nationalism, that this right, as you said, that inalienable right to self-determination is an essential. When does that right clock, in your mind, when does it cross the line?
Well, I mean,
and then you yourself say, no, that's ultranationalism or fascism.
I would say, at a first level, it crosses a line the minute you deny it to others, right? So the minute you are a champion of only your own self-determination claims and in the business of denying it for others, or the realization of your claim, the consequence of the realization of your claim is essentially to take it away from others, it crosses that line.
So let's play with that line for a second, and then I want to come to inside your society. But that means, your argument is that Jewish nationalism then is only legitimate if it also embraces Palestinian nationalism?
I think the Jewish people, not just because of my thinking about nationalism, but because of my thoughts about Jewish history and Jewish tradition, I think the Jewish people have to be champions of the self-determination of other people, not just their own. When we were minorities in other societies, we made the claim that those societies, to be moral and to live up to their own aspirations, needed to see us. And we in this position need discrimination, and its heart is Jewish.
So that would then lead to an interesting distinction between nationalism and ultranationalism, or nationalism and fascism.
Yeah.
That ultimately you see the rights of others and never your right overall.
Right.
That mine. It's not a conference. I have to.
Because it's not Jewish nationalism or Israeli nationalism that is the moral good. It is nationalism that is the moral good.
Right.
And we are champions
So it's not a
of...
merit. So ultranationalism is when you are. It's the concern for your society on steroids to the extent that other national rights just disappear.
And now the problem we face in the Israeli context, in my view, is not whether we should be champions of the self-determination rights of others, but whether that sentiment is reciprocated. What do you do if you feel like the people or the leaders of the people you're dealing with do not have that same mindset and are willing to acknowledge your own
So what do you
claim?
do?
So I think the one thing is you can't be naive. It's not, you're right in your lecture, you need to do more than your physical happiness and more than advancing values. You need to take risks. risks. There are yisurim, there are tribulations involved in this process, but there's a limit to those risks, right? And I don't think that this is a suicide pact in any way. But I also think that just because a given moment or even a period doesn't seem to show that reciprocity, you must constantly leave an opening for that reciprocity.
Tal, I appreciate very much your idea that one of the red lines that you can't cross is to assume that you're the only one who has that right to nationalism. But most of the challenges nationalism faces on an ongoing basis is not your national rights versus the potential national rights of somebody else, but how your nationalism affects your policies within your country, whether they are towards citizens, refugees, or even in war. What are the other red lines? Here we have one, Jewish nationalism or nationalism is legitimate as long as it assumes that other people have rights. What are other types of red lines that you feel are important?
Well, I mean, in the end, this is about identity, right? It's about seeing people in their whole selves, which also means seeing them as a right to live within a community, to have a story that they're able to continue. So one of the other red lines relates to Israel's non-Jewish citizens who have a separate story of who they are, and a deep obligation, I think, the Jewish majority has to that minority to enable them not just individual rights, but collective rights, in the sense that the right within this space to tell their own story and cultivate their identity. And though a lot of Israelis don't know it, Israel's laws try to create that system. We have educational autonomy, linguistic autonomy, cultural autonomy, precisely for that purpose. But we need a consciousness that makes us aware that this is a restraint on our nationalism. Our nationalism, the air in the nationalism can't be so dense and thick that no one else can breathe, that no one else can tell their own story.
So the second line is, it's not the rights of others to self-determination, but it's the rights of others to collective identity?
Well, this is an important thing that a lot of people don't understand. Self-determination is not equivalent to statehood. It's not equivalent to sovereignty. Self-determination means, in collective terms, that you have a space or a way in which your identity story is passed on. A lot of communities have self-determination without statehood. But to deny that part of who they are because of your nationalism is again a violation of what is at the heart of the moral idea of nationalism. A third line is to look outside of your nationalism to the rest of the world, not to other nationalisms, but to humanity as a whole. And our nationalism can't be so narcissistic, self-involved, that it doesn't see humanity around us, right? We as a country need a global agenda, not just an Israeli agenda. What is our position on climate change? What is our position on immigration globally? What are we, and we try to do this, but I'm not sure we articulate it in the terms of the nationalism that we have. It's a nationalism that's porous, that has a space for those of us who do the calibration of the balancing between the nation and humanity and other identities that we have in a more flexible way. So it's a dynamic concept.
So nationalism, the third red line is that nationalism can't always think in a zero-sum game context.
Right.
Let's take your 3 red lines and now put them on the fence in Gaza. Because the test of nationalism is to what extent you're only concerned for yourself or not only concerned for yourself. How do you use these when you try to implement it into policies of the Israeli government, the Israeli army, when we're facing terrorism, demonstrations, etc.?
Well, I mean, the first thing is to acknowledge that these are really complicated questions. I don't want to suggest that I have an answer to this dilemma. But I do think it operates on those 3 levels. At one basic level, the fundamental right to protect yourself from this threat is a moral right. It's a moral good from precisely the reasons mentioned in your lecture about the physical welfare of this people is something that is deserving of protection.
That we've come home in order for to have a place where we feel that our blood is important.
That's right. But at the same time, the mechanisms and measures you use to defend yourself can't be such that eradicate the very basic rights of the people you're defending yourself against, right? So you look at it. Are you acting proportionately? Are you distinguishing between combatants and civilians? Are you signaling in your messaging to the Palestinian people that your problem is not with their aspirations for self-determination? Your problem is with their opposition to your right to live alongside them.
So let's talk
and I would just say, sorry, but on the third level, there is something else operating maybe in that third line, and that is just a basic kind of sympathy for the humanity and the suffering involved in any kind of conflict. And I just see a place for just taking that on board in who you are. On the one hand, we want to broadcast to our enemies that they can't shake us so easily, yes? It's not good policy to suggest that you can mess with us and break our spirit too easily. But there's that, and on the other hand, there's this sense of celebration in victory and triumphalism that I think erases an element of humanity that we can't afford.
Maybe that's a 4th line, where your nationalism doesn't deny the humanity of the people who sometimes you have to enter into battle with in order to support your national interest. It reminds me of the time when the demonstrations in Gaza started. I think it was the first day where about 80 Gazans were killed. And I'm not getting into whether they were Hamas operatives or I'm not going into the legitimacy of what took place at that day. But at that same day, Israel won the Eurovision. That same day. And there was this huge demonstration as Netta Barzilai came, a huge celebration in Tel Aviv. So here it was, 60 miles away. One community was dying or was suffering a serious tragedy. And the other one, we were celebrating a victory. Maybe that's when nationalism allows that. When nationalism doesn't allow you to feel the loss or the suffering of another, maybe that's another place where nationalism, it's beginning, its fall and decline.
So I feel kind of conflicted about that. Part of me wants to say that we can't let Hamas take away from our national spirit in moments, but we can't be blind, right? And I think we're capable enough to be able to do both things somehow, to be able to see and speak and have sympathy, and at the same time stand tall and be proud of who we are. Nationalism is something to celebrate. In my view at least, it's something we should see as a blessing. But it's a blessing with a twist, right? It's a blessing that you have to be careful doesn't turn into a curse.
I want to ask you one final question. It's a question that I struggle with. And I know that the line should be there, but I don't know where to put it. In my lecture, I spoke about the fact that happiness cannot be the only goal. And that there has to be a moment that even pursuing your own life is not the value, the trolley case. What is the case where you choose not the maximum happiness for the maximum numbers of your citizens? And that for Israel to be a Jewish state, it also has to communicate together with strength. It also has to communicate strength in its willingness to at times suffer. Do you agree with that? And where would you put that? How do you deal with that?
So, I mean, in your lectures in this series, Daniel, you've spoke about this constant tension between being and becoming, right? Between the right we have simply to be and the aspiration we have to use that being to actually achieve and advance certain values and ideals. And that's a complicated dance all the time. There isn't a line you draw. There's a constant balancing act. I think there's something almost poetic, even tragic, in the fact that Israelis and Palestinians live so next to one another, and in a way live in the place where they're next door to the indigenous story that they had. Palestinians used to live on the coast and now live in Judea and Samaria in the West Bank, and the majority of the Israeli Jewish population lives along the coast, not in Bethlehem and Hebron and the places of the cradle of our civilization. Isn't there something amazing in that fact that we live like that? It's almost a cry to us to realize our nationalism with restraint, to be okay with the fact that we are next door neighbors to the places that are so critical to our story, and respect that in that particular place, another people will also live out their story.
It's almost as if you're saying that if nationalism is going to be redeemed, if the Israelis and Palestinians could work it out, then the whole category of nationalism could somehow be elevated to another space.
I think that's right, because we have been given the blessing of flexing a moral muscle, which is the capacity in the very space that is the most important to us to see another people. And they have been given the blessing of, in the very space that's most important to them, to see another people and respect that people's right to self-determination. And that's nationalism in its best moral sense. That nationalism with the restraint that sees the other even when it celebrates itself.
Tal, thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
All right, so what do you think? Yes, Steve.
So it made an argument that's very fundamental. I'm not sure it was trying to draw on the fundamental nature of it, but there's two ways of thinking about ethics. One set of ethics is that ethics are universals. This is the way people treat other people, and it just has to be that way. And the other way is to think about ethics as social contracts, to say that the reason that I can't steal from you is because you agreed not to steal from me. And these obligations that we have towards each other are only binding if both of us accept them. And if somebody's outside that agreement, to vis-a-vis the Palestinians, then they lose their rights, because their rights only come from being in this compact of agreement about what rights are. And if you don't agree to the compact, then you don't have any rights at all. And in my day job, I do have some affinity for social contract theory, but it has this implication which is a little uncomfortable here.
Yeah, Gary.
Yeah.
I'm still absorbing. Very interesting.
Okay.
But I certainly think that we see that argument, particularly on the Israeli right. Since the Palestinians don't accept our right to exist, we don't have any moral obligations of any kind towards them until they accept our right to be a state. And
Well,
I saw Becker basically making that argument. I was a little surprised by it.
yeah, I mean, I would say, I think he was saying something slightly different from what you just said, which is to say there's a difference between our responsibilities toward the Palestinians as a group and our responsibility toward the Palestinians as individuals. And I think he would say completely that we as, Israel has a moral responsibility to treat all individuals under their dominion with human dignity and respect and values drawn both from the Jewish tradition and from a sense of universal ethics. The question is, when their nationalism denies our right to have a nationalism, does our nationalism have to recognize their group? And I do think that there's a tension. I think that Tal Becker was being much more hopeful than you recast him as, right? I think he was speaking in positive terms, and you saw the negative shadow of what he said, which is, he said, look, isn't it great that we've been given this blessing of the potential to see each other as having a right to self-determination as a people in this land, and we've been flip-flopped on whose land is on which land, and isn't that just a glaring signpost in our face that we should be invested in each other's nationalisms? And you heard that also with the negative response, which is, yeah, and if they're not interested in our right to exist as a people, then we don't really have to be morally bound by their right to exist as a people.
Yeah, which I think is a dominant threat in Israeli politics right now.
Yeah, and you characterize it as right wing, and I would sort of say, I think that's fairly center right. I think most Israelis are there. That is to say, not that most Jewish Israelis are reluctantly at the point where they're yes, if the Palestinian people as a people don't recognize our right to exist as a people, then we don't have a lot of moral obligation to help them fulfill their nationalist dreams. Gary.
We started out talking about possessing land, and land is a very finite thing. You have a piece of land. It sounds to me, though, that in this, what they were talking about is the acceptance that even if we don't give Palestinians the land necessarily, that they could be happy with a degree of independence and recognizing them, their nationhood and a nation. Is it possible to share land with two nations? Is that ever going to be possible? Can you have a condominium? You have land, but everybody has their apartment above the land, and they own that apartment. To me, I sometimes think that's the only solution that could be viable, because otherwise we started this whole conversation out, we were given the land. And I found it interesting what he said, but we wound up with the shore and they wound up on the inland, which is probably considered less valuable these days, but that's another, although maybe not in the future.
Yeah, so I think,
and I don't think Israelis would go for sharing of land, and I don't think Palestinians would necessarily go for it.
No, I wonder what it would take, right? There are certain infrastructure that would have to be shared, right? Jointly owned. Roads and water supply, and certain infrastructure would have to be jointly owned. But then you could have, everybody who's living from the river to the sea, who considers themselves a national, belonging to the Palestinian national group, could vote in the Palestinian national elections, and everybody from the river to the sea who considers themselves in the Jewish national group could vote in the Jewish national elections, right? And those two governments would have to figure out how to work together on certain key issues of infrastructure and security. And then your problem of doing a partition goes away, because both Palestine and Israel are all the land from the river to the sea. They just exist, on top of each other, like your condominiums option. I just, that's very fantastical.
Yeah.
It's more or less the
Yes.
policy that Martin Buber and his group were advocating for in the 1940s, though. That idea was on the table originally.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, it's not a brand new idea. There
Oh, I thought of it. Oh, good.
there are
you go.
definitely
I was
definitely
gonna name
folks
it.
who have, there are
Well,
definitely
it's-
folks who have thought about this.
It's most relevant in talking about Jerusalem, I think, probably, in terms of that type of an arrangement. Because right now it's very much into the territorial partition idea, but
Right. All right, so we're gonna look at the basic nation state law. So just a quick, brief understanding. Israel has a Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence is used as a statement of values, sort of the way that our preamble to the Constitution is used as a statement of values. Okay. The Declaration of Independence says that they're going to write a constitution for the state of Israel. They never have. In the last 75 years of the state, there is no constitution. What there are sort of some basic laws. The concept of basic laws is drawn from the British system. The basic laws of the state of Israel are a mishmash of Jewish basic laws, Jewish laws, British mandate laws, Ottoman Turkish laws, and Napoleonic Code laws. The Napoleonic Code, because a lot of the Turkish laws are a mix of the Ottoman Empire adopted the Napoleonic Code, but mixed it with Islamic law. So the state of Israel inherited a lot of pre-existing legal structures from the governments that predated. The state of Israel has some basic laws, and they sort of function kind of similarly to the way that our Constitution functions, sort of, in that when courts have to decide on the legality of particular laws, they rule based on their how much they are connected to the and fit within the basic laws. The Knesset can make laws. The Knesset can also make basic laws, and the way to make a basic law is you have to have more of the Knesset voting for it or something. And I don't know all of the ins and outs of that. I'm sure you could look it up on Wikipedia. A few years ago, Israel voted on this. In 2018, they adopted a new basic law, and it was called the nation state law. And it got a lot of press at the time because a lot of people were like, oh, this nation state law is anti-Palestinian. It is more about Israel being a apartheid state and whatever. So let's read it, the basic law, and then we're gonna listen to two interviews that both interact with this nation state law. And I think they're fascinating and great. So we're going to enjoy them. Here we go. Here's the basic law. Israel is the nation state of the Jewish people. First, we have section 1, basic principles. The land of Israel is the historical homeland of the Jewish people in which the state of Israel was established. That, like 1A, is already in the Declaration of Independence. So it's kind of irrelevant. Like there's nothing new in that statement. The state of Israel is the national home of the Jewish people, in which it fulfills its natural, cultural, religious, and historical right to self-determination. Again, that is not that is also written in the Declaration of Independence. So nothing new there. 1C, the right to exercise national self-determination in the state of Israel is unique to the Jewish people. So notice it says the state of Israel, not the land of Israel. Okay, so is this enough? Probably it's not enough, right? What's more interesting than 1C is what 1C leaves out, right? That is to say, it makes sense to say that in the state of Israel, which is the Jewish state, the right to exercise national self-determination should only belong to the Jewish people. That isn't inconsistent with other basic laws. What's interesting is that if you're gonna bother to say it, you might also say something like, the state of Israel also recognizes the right of other groups to have self-determination in the land of Israel, or other groups to have self-determination, right? So that 1C does have new information. Okay.
1C is a little the way I read it is a little problematic. Does that imply that only Jews can vote and have the right to the national self-determination of the state?
No. National self-determination is not about citizenship, and it's not about the right to vote, right? All people can become citizens of the state of Israel and vote. Once they've gone through a naturalization process, then they're citizens of the state. The question is going back to this idea of individuals versus groups.
Yeah, individual rights versus collective rights. This is a statement about the collective rights of the Jewish people versus the collective rights of the Palestinian people. It's pretty clear who the other group is here. But it does not infringe on anybody's individual rights if they happen to be a citizen of the state of Israel.
Right, and it doesn't. Right, it's not just the Palestinian people. It's like the Druze cannot create a national homeland of the Druze in Israel, right? There are a lot of Druze who live in Israel and they see themselves as a group within Israel. Okay, it's not necessarily just about Palestinians, right? If you're there are a lot of Christians who live in Israel, but they can't join together as Christians to create to have national self-determination, right? This is a question of what you do with your minority populations. And in this case, it's sort of saying, the minority populations have a right to individual rights, but not national rights. All right, so then number 2,
I got one question.
Yeah, go ahead.
There's something odd about B, or at least it strikes me as odd. It says a state is a home, and a home sounds like a place, and a state doesn't sound like a place. State of Israel is a national home. Of course, it doesn't say national homeland, but what does it mean by a national home, if not a place?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, the 1B is also relating to you and me. That is to say, it's not just relating to Israeli citizens. The 1B is saying that this is the national home of the Jewish people in the world.
Well, what is the national home? Is it the state or is it a place?
Well, I think that's an interesting question.
The state is synonymous with the place, at least until we start annexing territory.
Well, no, I mean,
Exactly.
I do think that it's different, right? The 1A says the land of Israel is the historic homeland, and B is saying the state as an entity is one of the ways that it sees itself is as a home, right? What is this state doing? Why is this state existing? It is existing as a home of the Jewish people. All right, so in 2, when we get the symbols of the state, almost all of these are also covered by other basic laws. So these are not new to this law. But again, if you're going to restate things that are already laws and call them now, right? If you're restating them in the context of this nation state law, right? What you leave out is more important than what you put in, right? The name of the state is Israel. That doesn't tell you anything new. But the fact that they put it in tells you that they're very clearly saying that this land is not called Palestine. The state flag is white with 2 blue stripes near the edges and a blue Star of David in the center. The state emblem is a 7-branch menorah, right? So we know what the flag and the emblem look like. Like maybe someday there might be a time where this isn't the emblem of the state, right? But right now it is, and same with the anthem, right? Hatikva describes a 2,000-year-old hope of the Jewish people to be back in their land, right? Clearly that doesn't necessarily apply to non-Jewish citizens of the state of Israel, but at the moment, like, that is the national anthem of the state, and that's not going to change right away if it ever changes. Okay, the capital of the state is Jerusalem. The fact that it says here complete and united, that got a lot of press. Okay, because, well, Trump was the president and he switched the embassy and acknowledged Jerusalem as the complete and undivided capital of the state of Israel, right? So this, like, 3 got a lot of press. 4 is about language, and it's very confusing, is the truth, right? The state's language is Hebrew. State actually has like 3 national languages: Hebrew, Arabic, and English. At least it did during British mandate. Those were the 3 languages of the state, and then Israel sort of accepted those languages, and so, like, all of the street signs are in Hebrew and Arabic and English. So here in this law, it says the state's language is Hebrew and the Arabic language has a special status. What is the difference between having it be a state language and a special status? It's not clear at all what the difference is between those things legally. Okay, regulating the use of Arabic in state institutions or by them will be set in law. In other words, right, Arabic is one of the languages that you can conduct state business in. This clause does not harm the status given into the Arabic language before this law came into effect. In other words, basically, we're making no changes.
Except that A and B explicitly make changes. This article is completely internally contradictory and was deliberately written to be that way.
Yeah, I mean, that's one way to read it. it is definitely a confusing article. All right, Article 5,
I
the state will be
wanna make
open for Jew. Oh, yes,
Okay.
sorry, go ahead.
I got one more comment to make.
Yeah.
Back, can you scroll up to 3 again?
Yeah.
Recognizing Jerusalem as the united capital of Israel. Did Congress address that at some point? Decades ago, or a decade or two ago?
Congress has
Yeah.
accepted that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel in every Congress for the last, 40 years or something. The executive branch of our government did not also recognize that until Trump.
Executive branch, that's right. Okay, got it.
But-
That's correct.
But
I think that's,
our Congress has passed a resolution accepting Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, like in every Congress for many, many decades.
got it. Okay, that's what I thought.
I have another question about a possible contradiction. Go back to 1 for a second.
Yeah.
It says the land of Israel, historic homeland, Jewish people, and state of Israel was established. It's when the state was established, which has certain boundaries and borders, which didn't
Right.
include an undivided, which didn't include all of Jerusalem, and yet further down we say it's all of Jerusalem. Are those two contradictory?
No, because the land of Israel is broader than the state of Israel. The state of Israel,
The land of Israel is historic
the
homeland.
state of Israel is within the land of Israel, but all of Jerusalem is also within the land of Israel. So when the state expands to include all of Jerusalem, it isn't inconsistent with it's inconsistent with the boundaries of the state at the time
I
it was
see.
established, but it's not inconsistent with the statement that the state of Israel is established within the historical homeland of the land of Israel, right? That is to say,
I see it.
yeah,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah. Interesting. The way that's worded. Yep.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the big arguments about the UN resolution partitioning the state is that the UN resolution says that the Jewish people shall have a state in the land of Israel. Or but the word "in," it isn't clear whether that means the whole boundaries of the land. Or maybe that's not the partition. Maybe that's the Balfour Declaration. His Majesty's government looks with favor on the establishment of a state of a national state for the Jewish people in Palestine. And the question is that all of Palestine from the river to the sea, or some part of Palestine? And at the same time, the British government also wrote all these white papers to the Arabs promising them to have national to have control over the same land. So, but the Balfour Declaration so I just quoted or got very close to it. It's this same question of like, what does it mean to have a state in a land that is broader than that state? And Jabotinsky was very clear. I mean, the land of Israel includes some of what is now Jordan, the most expansive borders of the state. I mean, borders of the land of Israel. In Talmudic times, in biblical times, right, are much bigger than what the state is now. All right, so the state will be open for Jewish immigration and the ingathering of exiles. Again, that is covered in other basic laws. There's nothing new there. 6, connection to the Jewish people. The state will strive to ensure the safety of the members of the Jewish people in trouble or in captivity due to the fact of their Jewishness or their citizenship. So this is fairly explicit and new. I mean, the state of Israel has always seen itself as doing this. That's part of why, the IDF like helped to to get Jews out of Ethiopia. You know, why the IDF tries to save, you know, the raid on Entebbe, tries to free Jewish people from, you know, terrorists all over the world, right? The Israeli government has always seen themselves this way. Now they made it part of the basic law is that they really see themselves as responsible for you and me. There's a topic later on of sort of one of the challenges that we will end up discussing is this being accused of dual loyalty. And as an American, right, the fact that the Jewish state is being so territorial, like they're laying claim to me in a way that maybe I didn't ask them to. The state shall act within the diaspora to strengthen the affinity between the state and the members of the Jewish people. The state shall act to preserve the cultural, historical, and religious heritage of the Jewish people among Jews in the diaspora. That means that they're willing to spend money to help pay for us to care about that. Right?
Not just that they're willing, but that they're obligated to do so.
They're obligated to. Yeah, they are supposed to help, you know, pay for things like birthright.
Do they?
I believe they do.
Okay.
I believe they do. Jewish settlement. The state views the development of Jewish settlement as a national value and will act to encourage and promote its establishment and consolidation. Right? That very clearly doesn't say in the land of Israel. It doesn't say in the state of Israel. It's Jewish settlement, period. But a detractor might say, oh, see, they want to build settlements in the West Bank. And person who's defending this might say Jewish settlement just means Jews living there. It could be in the Galilee, right? This doesn't mean settlement like building settlements in the West Bank, but it does sort of include that, right?
I'm not deeply familiar with all this. So this legislation was first proposed in 2012 and it went through iterations to make it acceptable. I have a memory, which I can't back up off the top of my head, that there was a more explicit statement about where the settlement was to be in some of the earlier drafts, and it was muted down for final passage. I can't promise that, but I think that's the case.
Yeah, so we do have the basic law proposal. We have a version that wasn't accepted into law as one of our texts. But the settlement doesn't seem to be in that. So that feels like it was added into this one. All right, so official calendar, you got to use the Hebrew calendar. Independence Day is an official national holiday of the state, as are Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaShoah, right? Both of those. Sabbath and the festivals of Israel are established days of rest in the state. Non-Jews have a right to maintain days of rest on their Sabbaths and festivals. This basic law shall not be amended unless by another basic law. And then there are some omitted clauses from the original draft that ended up losing, that ended up going out. And that includes this stuff, Steve, on settlements. So omitted clauses, Every Israeli resident, regardless of religion or nationality, is entitled to take action to preserve his culture, heritage, and the preservation of his language and identity. And the state may allow a community, including members of one religion or one nationality, to maintain a separate communal settlement. Those were left out of section 7.
Hmm. Hmm.
All right, so it's an interesting law. Let's check out this
What year was the law? Did you say?
2018. 2018.
It had been in formulation for quite a while before that, but I think it was first proposed in Knesset in 2012, and then it got updated. There have been way more than 2 drafts of it.
Yes.
But it finally got a voting majority in 2018.
And prior to that, there was nothing comparable?
Well, like I said, a lot of the stuff in it is also in other basic laws. But yes,
No,
there's
not
nothing-
in other basic laws. It's in other legislation, but it's not in basic laws. The key issue here, I don't want to too far, but basic laws cannot be replaced except by supermajorities. The law is a little unclear what it takes to replace one, but it takes more than a majority vote to do it. Part of the reason the nation state law was created was because the political center right and right, which had a majority at that time, knew that they might lose that majority. So they put some of their positions into basic law to make them immune to being repealed by a left center majority unless it had a supermajority. And that was what a lot of the Israeli politics about this law was enshrining right-wing positions or center right positions in a place where they would be unable to be done by majority vote later.
Right, that is true. It is also true that much of this stuff also was previously done in other basic laws, but some of the most important clauses were not.
So just this, in my mind, the term basic law is almost like an amendment to the Constitution.
That's
because
right.
it takes a higher level as opposed to a regular law. Israel has a basic law and they have regular law.
Right. And the
Okay,
basic laws are more like the Constitution, and the other laws are just like laws.
Yeah, Rabbi is right. It's more like a constitution, but the legality, the legal force of a basic law is the subject of much interpretation and dispute in the Israeli court system. It's not exactly clear how strong these basic laws are.
Right. Well, like I said at the beginning, they don't have a constitution, and it's very unclear. And like I said, also some of the basic laws, some of the laws are just like a stacked conglomerates of other laws from other sources, laws that pre-existed the state. It's very confusing, but also very interesting. Yeah, Gary, you have to unmute.
How's that?
Yeah.
Okay. The law doesn't mention Palestinians, and the word Palestinian sometimes is confusing to me. It seems to me that when I was younger, that the term Palestinian included the Jews who resided in Palestine, whereas now it's thought of as excluding the Jews. And it was just an extra layer of confusion was added today with the comment about exchanging places and thinking of the Palestinians as a coastal people, which I think may be confusing it with, I mean, linguistically, Palestine is connected with the Philistines, who were a coastal people, but I don't think those are the same. I don't think the current people have anything to do with the Philistines.
No. Though the reason why the land is called Palestine is because the Romans, Hadrian, when he destroyed Jerusalem and renamed it Ilia Capitolina, like he also renamed the province from the province of Judea, which it was the Roman province of Judea. He renamed the Roman province Palestine after the Philistines. So it's not unrelated, but yes, it is not completely related either. The current Palestinian nation does not see themselves as the cultural inheritors of the Philistines. It is true that Palestine and Palestinian has been a term that has shifted over time. It is true that many Jews saw themselves, especially in the pre-state era, as being Palestinians, and that identity has shifted over time. It now generally it refers to an ethnicity as opposed to it's an ethnic group with national aspirations. There are people of that ethnic group, right? 70% or so of the people who live in the Kingdom of Jordan are ethnically Palestinian. When Tal Becker referred to the coastal people versus the mountain people, right? He meant that the homeland of the Jewish people is not Tel Aviv or Haifa. The homeland of the Jewish people is Bethlehem and Hebron. That is to say, our national home is in the Judean hills, right? Judea and Samaria, what is currently called the West Bank, okay, where most of the residents there are Palestinians ethnically, right? That is where Palestine is, such as it is. The Palestinian Authority has authority over Bethlehem and Hebron, and Beit El and Nablus, which is Shechem. Those are the places that our ancestors lived. When he says that the Palestinian people were that we switched places with them, what he means is that in pre-state, in 1947, the majority of the Palestinians who lived in the land from the river to the sea, the majority of the people who are ethnically Palestinian, the Arabs who lived there, mostly lived in places like Jaffa on the coast. And they were told to leave their homes in Jaffa and Lida and other places and to flee in expectation of war, that then they would be able to return to their homes. And the Jewish state prevented them from returning to their homes, right? But there are a lot of folks, in Palestinian refugee camps who still have the keys to their great-grandparents' house in Haifa, in Jaffa, okay? And so those places were more ethnically Palestinian before 1948. And that's what he means by us having sort of flip-flopped in our national aspirations. Now those places are in Israel proper, and Bethlehem and Hebron are in Palestine.
Well, I mean, Jaffa and Haifa, I think, are still largely Arabic.
Jaffa is. Haifa is a very, very mixed population. And those folks are ethnically Palestinian, but nationally Israeli. So it is complicated.
I'm going to toss in one more question, although it's a little out of, I don't want to distract you too much, but you're mentioning that the ancient home was more like the West Bank. It somehow seems inconsistent with the description of a land of milk and honey. The West Bank seems to me very desert-like and inhospitable. And so the description from Genesis, from whatever that first reading was, really confuses me a little bit.
Yeah. Well, Deuteronomy is very clear that this land is not a particularly hospitable land. It's a land that relies on water from God, as opposed to natural sources of water, like more free flowing rivers. That is to say, you can only live in Israel with rain until desalinization, like until recent. And that is a part and parcel of the theology of the Jewish people that is contained in the Bible and passed on, through the generations. So yeah, I mean, I think you're right? Land flowing with milk and honey. That means, right? That's dates. That's
Like you said, I've heard
yeah.
that the name Greenland was given to Greenland as a way of attracting people. To come there.
Yeah.
It was a joke.
All right. Let's see what you think of this.
This session will be comprised of two interviews, one with social and political activist Muhammad Darawsha, and the other with Professor Moshe Koppel, representing differing positions regarding the 2018 Basic Law of Israel as the nation-state of the Jewish people. Much of the recent debate around Israeli nationalism has focused on either the moral failing, if not depravity, of this law, on how it undermines Israel as a democracy, or on its moral and legal legitimacy and significance for the future of Israel as a Jewish democratic state. In these interviews, we will give each position a significant hearing. Let's start with the most difficult question first. As an Israeli Arab Palestinian, what are your feelings about Jewish nationalism?
Well, first of all, I've learned to live with it. It's been around for all of my lifetime. I'm almost 57, and it's 57 years when it talks to me. The first part of Jewish nationalism, which was the creation of the State of Israel in 1948, was traumatic for my people. It's not something that we were happy about implementation of Jewish nationalism.
It wasn't your tikva, it wasn't your dream.
No, it's not our dream, it's not our nationalism, and it came on the expense of what we now define as our nationalism, as our Palestinian nationalism, which maybe was not formulated as pure Palestinian nationalism at the time. So there are a number of ways I look at Jewish nationalism. One is historic Jewish nationalism, which translated itself in the creation of the State of Israel, where I live. It translated itself by the fact that the Jewish nationalism immigrated on my turf, on my territory. It came to me and challenged the way I define myself. So it's not just, I'm not just an Arab, I'm not just a Palestinian, I'm an Israeli Arab or an Israeli Palestinian. I became hyphenated as a result of Jewish nationalism because of the project that it created, the State of Israel.
But if I could stop you for a moment, you're hyphenated. In other words, Jewish nationalism is part of your nationalism?
Of course. I mean, I live Jewish nationalism. It's part of my identity today. It's infiltrated my life. I've learned Tanakh, I've learned Sefer Rut, I've learned Jewish religious and national identity and narrative. I know about the first Aliyah and the second Aliyah. It's become part of the culture that I've absorbed and the part of the culture that I interact with, and it's definitely part of my destiny.
So how do you feel about it?
I have a dialogue with
essentially,
it.
you have a dialogue.
I have a dialogue with
Tell me
it.
about that dialogue. What is
I have a dialogue with it. First of all, I think Jewish nationalism is legitimate, as Palestinian nationalism is legitimate, as any nationalism is legitimate. But I think it's an immature nationalism. I think it's a nationalism that is troubled nationalism because it doesn't know how to live, first of all, with me, as someone who is not Jewish national, as someone who does not have the Jewish soul, as someone who does not subscribe to the Jewish historic identity.
You don't see yourself as someone who came out of Egypt.
No. If we did come out from somewhere, it's probably from Saudi Arabia. And I like many of the Jewish souls, and I like many of the components of Jewish nationalism. So it's not just that I got exposed to it, but I also, much of it I like and I appreciate and I respect. But the other part of the dialogue is parts of it I dislike, parts of it are troubling for me, parts of it are threatening for me. And
In what way threatening?
Well, when some of the approaches where Jewish nationalism thinks it's exclusive for the state of Israel, trying to create synonymous identity between Israeliness and Jewishness, as if other identities do not exist in the country, and trying to eliminate the legitimacy of other identities and other national identities in the country. Nationalism in general, I think, can thrive only if it takes two actions. One, if it knows how to coexist with democracy, and second, if it knows how to live with minorities. Otherwise, I think nationalism gets stuck
into ultranationalism, to use our category.
Ultranationalism, and sometimes it even goes into
Even to fascism.
fascism and racism afterwards. And I think that Israeli Jewish nationalism is that debate area. Does it get it's stuck? Does it release itself into the negative, in the wrong direction, or does it go in the right direction?
But you're posing something which is very novel, and I want to put it on the table. There's a complexity that you're trying to hold that in our bifurcated, polarized political discourse, nobody's comfortable. So I really want to spend I want to spend time. I really want to understand you, because it's a remarkable statement about the future of Israeli Arab Palestinians in Israel.
And I think that Jewish nationalism, the success of Jewish nationalism, is not by the creating a homeland for the Jewish people only. If it stops there, I think pure ethnic homeland for the Jews is not going to last for too long. The success of the Jewish national project is in its ability to create a legitimate space for itself in two places. One, inside the state of Israel, by creating an inclusive Israeli identity and not an exclusive synonymous Jewish identity. And it's in its ability also to interact with its surrounding. But first of all, let's stay in the internal aspect of the Israeli Jewish national identity. 71 years, the Arab citizens of Israel, we've learned to become Israeli. In my perspective, the Jewish nationalism did not learn to become Israeli. You're not there yet. And there's a retreat. It's a mindset of a minority. You're retreating all the time to try to create more possessiveness of the Israeli shared space and make it more Jewish. Shared space, not just physical space, but the joint narrative of statehood that we can potentially create together. The Israeli Jewish nationalism concept is trying to confiscate that for Jews only, where I'm able to come forward, extend an arm, extend my heart, and say, not only that I've learned how to live with you for the last 71 years, I want to create a way where we can live together for the next 7,000 years. And I'm happy that Israel will always serve as the homeland of the Jewish people. But that's not the only thing about Israeliness. And that's not the only thing about Jewish nationalism. Jewish nationalism needs to know how to live with me as it needs to save a Jew that lives in Brazil.
So you're saying it's fascinating. You're almost telling Jewish nationalism to make aliyah, to leave
To Israelize itself.
To Israel. Here it is. You decided. You didn't come to a place which had no people. You came to a reality called Israel. And in that reality, it's in the Middle East. And in that reality, there's 20%. Remember, Jews are 2% of the American community. And look at the place. Here it is. There's 20%. We're here. Make aliyah and see me.
Some Jews still believe that this was a land without people for people without a land. Those that have come here, they've had 71 years to get beyond that. They already know that it's this land at least has some leftovers of the people that were called Palestinians, Arab, it doesn't matter what's the historic aspect. The reality is today that Israel has 20% of its citizens who are Arab citizens. They're here to stay. They're here to stay by force, maybe 1948, by choice today.
But by choice today.
By choice today. One is, and as I said, that we know how to live side by side with the Jews as people, as individuals, but also with the Jews as a collective, as a national project. We know how to live with you. We know how to challenge you also by saying the space you're giving to us right now is not enough. I want to be equal to you. I want to live with proper, dignified relationship where I value your son as much as you value my son.
What is that? Be concrete. What do you feel the Israeli national project, as the project of the homeland of the Jewish people, is not hearing from you?
First of all, my legitimacy, that I want to be part of the national priority of the state of Israel. Israel's national priority cannot be just to take care of the Jewish people here and the Jewish people outside. I want to be third leg for this relationship.
That you're referencing in many, that's the nation-state law is that what you're referencing?
I'm leading towards that.
Yeah.
The nation-state law, which is one out of 81 different laws in Israel that are discriminatory in nature. And the nation-state law comes to crown a process that is trying to Judaize the national identity of Israel for Jews only, on the expense of the Israeli identity of the state, which is basically creating de facto and de jure hierarchical society. It's saying to me, I'm not equal to you, Daniel. And I'm not willing to accept that. I don't have an inferiority complex that is willing to accept being second-class citizen, not by declaration, and some say it's only declaratory statement. I'm not willing to accept being second-class citizen only by declaration and not by law and not in daily practice in social economic rights. I'm sorry, I don't have an inferiority complex. I don't see my kids as lower or inferior than any Jewish kid inside the state of Israel. I don't see my mother as inferior to your mother. I don't see myself as inferior to anyone. And I want this to be put on the table. It's first of all about respect. The state of Israel, Jewish nationalism does not know how to respect minority. Does not know how to respect a minority, does not know how to respect your immediate neighbor. Jews know how to respect their immediate neighbor. Jewish nationalism does not know how to respect their immediate neighbor. And I think that's the first, most missing element, to create either a declaration or basic law. Now it's a constitutional law. And to say to me, take it, because we, the collective power of the Jews, the majority decides, knows how to decide. Yes, so you have the power. You're abusing it for yourself, you're not abusing me. You're trying to tell me a story that really gets into this ear, comes out from that ear. I care less about the law. The law, the nation state law, I think is disgrace for the state of Israel. It's disgrace for Jewish nationalism because it says you do not know how to accept the concept of democracy. You do not know, you're not mature enough to run a democracy.
Why?
As equal.
What part of it doesn't say that? Is it because of what it says or because of what it doesn't say?
It's first of all because of what it says when it talks about encouraging Jewish settlement only. Why? Don't I deserve to have also future settlement projects for my family, for my kids? I mean, what's wrong with me? I'm not willing to accept anything wrong with me. It also has a problem with what it doesn't have. It takes out the word equality as a principle and as a practice. And this will have a trickle-down effect in many other legislations. It's a gateway.
So your challenge to Jewish nationalism is to say, see me, add another
Mature.
clause. So be mature, see me, talk to me. Don't just talk about the Jews settlements. Don't just talk about, here it is, I'm a citizen, recognize me.
I want you to stop being selfish.
Our selfishness, in your mind, expresses itself principally in what areas?
In trying to create that hierarchy. In trying to create hierarchy.
Concretely, where does it express itself?
Well, it expresses itself, unfortunately, in many places. It expresses itself with the fact that when my daughter was accepted to do her master's degree in genetics at Tel Aviv University, they put her end of the line in getting dormitories. Right? When she should, the state of Israel, if she was seen as an Israeli only and not an Arab first and then Israeli student, they would have hugged her and put her in the top of the list because of her grades. It exemplifies itself with the fact that when I go home and I see the infrastructure of my village and I come to your neighborhood and I see the infrastructure of your village, I know that I live in a poverty village, in a poverty neighborhood, and you live in a privileged town. I work as hard as you, and I pay equal taxes as everyone else. And because of the discriminatory policy in budgeting and for infrastructure, Arab citizens live in poverty villages, in the job opportunities, where for my son to find a job, he can't find a job in his town because the town has been neglected for 70 years. No zoning plans to allow the development of industrial zones to be able to bring jobs. And he has to travel an hour, together with almost 50% of our labor force has to leave the village every morning, travel for about an hour and come to sleep in the town. We become like motels. Our villages are more like motels and not real towns during the weekend. Why? Because of government institutional policy of discrimination. That's failure of, not just Jewish nationalism, of any nationalism that doesn't know how to live with the other components of society.
Now, most multinational states in the Middle East aren't working. They're not.
True.
Most of them are not. What you're calling for in Israel is a unique experiment.
No, I do not accept that. What I'm calling for in Israel to fulfill the promise of the Declaration of Independence. What I'm calling for in Israel is to fulfill even the surrender agreement that my grandfather signed on. What I'm calling for in Israel is to fulfill the 5 basic laws that guarantee human dignity. I'm not asking you to compare yourself to anything else in the Middle East. I'm asking you to stand by the promise and by the laws that you said as Jewish nationalism. This is who we are.
Now,
if that's who you are,
I'm with you.
Do it.
So if you could change the Jewish nation state law, let's say it stays the way it is. It's not going to be repealed. It's there. What would you change in that law?
I will not change anything in it. It has to go.
It has to, you have to,
It has to go. It's an insult. It was,
even if it added an equality clause.
even if it added that.
Why would that not be enough?
It was born in a sin.
Okay, but let's say we're not purists.
Uh,
You're not a
maybe-
purist.
maybe-
We know each other for I don't know how many years. You're not a purist. You're someone who is
I'm
very, very
practical and
astute.
pragmatic.
You're very, very practical. This law is here. Forget. I know it was insulting. I can't. Here. That's like it reminds me. We can't go back to. Here it is. I know it was insulting. What clauses? So I understand the notion, and I understand it very deeply, that the clause which so-called took out the apartheid clause, which spoke about separate citizens, separate Jewish, the right to live in separate communities, which would have allowed absolute discrimination between Jews, and we couldn't live together. Now only supports Jewish settlement. It should support the settlement of all Israelis because that's what enables you the economic prosperity, etc. Let's say the law would add to it, there would be an equal rights legislation. Let's say there'd be another clause which would say, here in the Jewish nation state, in the homeland of the Jewish people, we recognize that there is a significant Arab-Palestinian minority, and we recognize them as a national entity within the context of the state of Israel, and we reach out with the hope of building relationships abroad. At least if there was real, here it is. You have a chance. You're going to rewrite it. They come to you and say, give me 2 clauses that here you say to Jews, listen, I've shown you respect. Now, this is what you need to add. What would you put it?
To show me respect, once again, I would say it has to go. It has to be eliminated. I'm not willing to start from a starting point that what was written is even legitimate, even for the last year since it has been done. This was an illegitimate act, aggressive act against our community, insulting act against our community. This insulting act has to be taken
Can I
out.
ask you honestly, do you feel you're setting yourself up then for failure?
Probably.
So
Probably.
then- but
It's
you don't-
setting,
but that's
it's
not who
setting
you are.
myself up, and it's setting also
We're
Jewish
up. That's
and
correct.
Jewish nationalism
That's
for
correct.
failure.
It's correct.
It's a
So
mutual
then-
failure.
I know that's just. Are you creating? I know I feel this very often in Israeli-Palestinian conflicts, where the only way that you can move forward is if I have Jaffa.
Corrective justice.
And we're not. So are you in here? Are you so insulted that you almost that we need some more time before we can become constructive
Probably.
again?
Maybe I'm not the generation that will be able to really
But
talk.
I don't want to wait another generation,
But
Mohammed.
and for that you need to be able to sit with me in a place that is welcoming. The
That I
discussion
accept.
the discussion about the nation state law is not welcoming discussion. From my point of view, keep it. Right? Let's talk about the constitution. I'm not willing to amend it.
Fair enough.
Keep it.
Okay.
Keep it, and I will know that
So give me
hopefully
another-
one
so give me-
generation.
So,
or
what you're saying? Give me another nation. Give me another nation state.
Yeah, we'll call it-
call it another basic law.
another basic law. Let's agree on another basic law.
The basic
And
law
then-
of Israeli citizenship.
And then there will be enough people that will challenge the nation state law that it negates the constitution of the state of Israel. Let's work on something that we can create together. I have no problem, as I said, with Jewish nationalism. I have no problem with the state of Israel defining this itself as the homeland of the state, the homeland of the Jewish people, as long as it knows how to grant me the status of a national minority also. So grant me, it's the same sentence, the homeland of the Jewish people and its Arab national minority. So I feel that I have a homeland as well. I don't want to be homeless into this process. Why should you have a homeland and I shouldn't? So fine, it's a homeland for you as the Jewish collective majority here, plus because of respect for the Jewish homeland concept, it's also the homeland of the Jews outside the state of Israel, but I'm not willing to be outside the game. It has to be also my homeland constitutional. You can't border your rights as a majority and not border my rights as a minority.
Your whole career has been about furthering coexistence. It's been about breaking out of the boxes of how an Israeli Arab is supposed to see, or Israeli Arab is supposed to see the Jewish state, and how you demand Jews see you. In this project of coexistence, which is a coexistence that is willing to shake the boundaries and demand synthesis that many people aren't willing to do, and you do them in your own life, your whole career, and you've suffered greatly for it. As you look forward, are you hopeful?
First of all, it'll be with more suffering, I guess.
There'll be more
But
suffering.
I am hopeful. I think that despite this constitutional vertical debate over the identity of the state and this collective political space that we're trying to create, we have a horizontal life that we have created in it many islands of success. It is in the medical industry, it's in universities, it's in the workplace, it's in interactions between Jewish and Arab municipalities.
It's starting to show that it's possible.
It's not even started. We're really beyond the basics of proving that it works. We know how to live together. My daughter knows how to be very good friends with Jewish colleagues at the Hebrew University. My son, who works at the company, he knows how to be both the boss of Jewish employees, but also bossed by another hierarchy of Jewish employees. He brings them to our home. He goes to their home. They go to the movies together. We know how to be friends. We know how to create business together. We know, and you know what? I think we've been blessed that violence has not really become the real
It's a-
way that we solve
It's not a
problems.
factor between Israeli Jews and
It's
Israeli
not.
Arabs.
If you come to my village with your kippah and ask for my house, you probably no one was going to ask you a question about your kippah and your Jewish identity, and you'll find more
Jews
people
are,
willing to
Jews
invite
are
you to their
completely
homes.
safe.
And I
in
feel safe
every-
in Jewish towns.
That's correct.
And I feel safe in Jewish towns. And I feel safe. My daughter is in Tel Aviv, and my son is in Harish today. And that's we have not crossed the line of negativity that has exemplified itself in fear about the
So
personal
what you're saying is
relationship.
that we've worked it on a personal, we've worked in so many places. Now we have to have the courage to put Jewish nationalism on the table and to expand it, to put Jewish nationalism on the table and help redefine it, in your terms, as an Israeli phenomena that has space for others within our midst.
Daniel, at the end of the day, it's not about Jewish nationalism. It's about Israeli nationalism. Can we create an Israeli nationalism? The debate is not between this version of Jewish nationalism versus another version of Jewish nationalism. It's not Jewish nationalism G1, G2, G3. The G4 of Jewish nationalism is Israeli nationalism. Can we create an Israeliness that one cares for Jewish nationalism and cares for me as a national minority with enough shared interdependency, enough shared narratives that we can build together so that we can think about the next 7,000 years together and not just worry about the last 71 years that we've been together.
From your mouth to God's ears. Muhammad, thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you, Daniel.
All right. So what did you think of that interview?
I would take him on the condo board.
What would you say?
If I had a condominium concept, I
Oh.
could live with him. It's fine. I agree. I mean, I totally agree with him.
Yeah, he makes a lot of sense. And it's good
Found
to
that
hear.
most uplifting.
It's good to hear
Wonderful.
somebody from that side talking about things in rational terms and as with a stake in Israel as a state. Yeah.
Any other thoughts?
I agree with him that the minorities in Israel should be respected, but I'm not sure that there specifically needs to be statements for the Arab minority, just minorities in general. I mean, the Druze, all these other minorities, do we have to list every single minority out in these documents? So that I had a little issue with that, but the general concept that he was saying, I agree with.
I have a question. Do many? I would think the probably answer is they do. How many Israelis? If they listen to him, how many would disagree with him? What's the percentage of people in Israel that might disagree with somebody that comes across as reasonable as he does?
Jewish or Arab or both?
Jewish.
And most people are not Mohammed Darwashi. And most people in Israel, both Israeli Arab minority and Jewish majority, aren't where he is.
That's bad.
It was kind of heartbreaking to hear how he felt. I definitely can see his side of the argument.
Yeah. Well, we don't have time to listen to the other half of this interview is an interview with one of the writers of the Israeli nation state law, one of the crafters. So maybe we'll start with that next time. I have to go through next week's unit 8, and decide what like what makes sense, but I will do that. We are meeting next Thursday night, even though it's winter February break. I hope that you have a great week. Oh yeah,
What-
Gary.
One quick question. Where are these recordings stored?
Everything is on the Hartman online website that you all have access to. And if you're having trouble accessing it, send me or Jack an email and we'll help you get the access.
Yeah.
Also,
if you didn't
also,
log
I
in
have
and
been
create an account
recording.
there, you don't have it.
I have been recording these lectures, and you can find them on our YouTube page. So, yeah. Okay.
Thank you,
Good
everyone.
night, everyone.
Good night. Good night.
Night.
Right.
Thanks very much.